Welcome back, Doubts Aloud listeners. This episode is going to be the part 2 that we promised. That's covering further on the subject we talked about when we had Josh and John on not so long ago, and that's what that self-titled McGrewvianism aspect of this particular group of apologists that are really kind of outside mainstream scholarship, and sort of we will recover through Ed right now on exactly what happened in that last episode and then where we're going to go in this one.
Well, they sort of made a list for us as they went through the issues where they had a critique of McGrewvianism. And Jonathan McLatchie, who is a sort of friend of the show because he's been our guest, and we had a really helpful and constructive discussion with him back in episode 3 or so. And he has written a blog article pushing back on the show called Have John and Josh Refuted the Reportage Model? And so we're going to be kind of concentrating on that for this show.
Okay, so just for anybody listening, just stumbling across this before they haven't heard the other one, the previous show, what essentially is this particular group of apologists about? If you could just sum it up.
They are taking a very robust, what they call evidentialist view, saying that there is strong evidence that the Gospels and Acts, the kind of historical narratives in the New Testament, are historically reliable. And then they can use that to fill out the resurrection argument. So it becomes a lot more robust than the minimal facts argument for the resurrection that's been current. And generally, it just supports their very conservative view, which is pretty well inerrantist when it comes to the New Testament documents.
Yes, I mean, they don't actually say, they're quite proud of saying we're not inerrantist, but when it boils down to it, it's so close, it's marginally different, hardly different from what I can see. So yes, so when we were discussing this subject, actually, that last episode is actually a carry on in one sense from when we had Jonathan on, as you were mentioning, to talk about one aspect of their movement, which was called Undesigned Coincidences. So you can go back to the previous episode with Jonathan McLatchie to find out more about that, and we will be touching on that again today.
Well, it'll be the majority of what we're talking about.
Okay, actually. Yeah, that was Jonathan's response was in fact on a reworking of his response to John Nelson original 2020 article. But yeah, so this particular group are very much to use this term that you just used, phrase, the reportage model, i.e. that the Gospels are simply reporting actual events, historical, and that they're all intertwined and that they all back up each other, and that we're talking almost basically very hard. If you had a video, you'd really see these things which were being written about. That's the way I understand it, as opposed to mainstream scholarship, which is so far away from that it's just so difficult to actually sum up the distinct differences, but they're so vastly different. But we'll get there.
Yeah, and yeah. I think the two planks they are relying on are robust pushbacks against supposed contradictions, and this undesigned coincidence argument that we'll be filling out.
Yes, indeed, that's true. So that's, I think, where we got to last time with Josh. They were sort of talking on the sort of bigger picture of their particular approach that wasn't taking on board or dealing with adequately mainstream scholarship, but rather as a test case was sort of setting it aside. And so that seems to be, as far as I can see, is that they've got, rather than actual robust takedowns of every major strand of mainstream scholarship that wouldn't support this reportage view of the Gospels. Would that be a good way to put it?
I think so. Yeah. So what we're going to do is have a chat about a general point they make, and then get stuck into the item by item critiques that John and Josh provided for us.
Okay.
So on the general point, there's a quote from quite near the beginning of the blog, and which is, I think, quite pertinent. So let's start with that. Who wants to read that one?
Francis?
Shall I? Yes, I was just about to volunteer.
Okay. Yep. I'll volunteer you.
Yep. Okay. He says, John and Josh are both professing Christians, though this puzzles me, given that they apparently do not believe the Gospels are reliable or that one can make a robust argument for Jesus' resurrection. I'm thus curious on what basis they affirm the truth of Christianity.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's
yes.
Put the cat amongst the pigeons. Isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Ed, do you want to say something on that? I got something.
Well, I don't think. I think it's a minority view, and they're saying it's a modern minority view. This is John and Josh, that you have to believe the reliability of the Gospels in order to become a Christian and to maintain your Christianity.
Yeah.
So they were quite clear on that and gave some quotes, I think, right back for some vague, fairly early church fathers to support that view. And I think Jonathan is just sort of doubling down really on the McGrewvian view without giving pushback.
Yeah, it seems to me they're just selecting, just like religious movements do, and sort of groups get into cliques and set their own boundaries for who's in and who's out. Because, again, in my experience of Christianity, it's amazing how many Christians I know that would be outside the bounds of another group of Christians. I was, when I was in YWAM, the Youth with a Mission, I met a group of Pentecostals who said we weren't really Christians because of we weren't a church. We were a sort of a parachurch and they weren't of godly or whatever. And so I was astounded. And that's just one of many, many, many differences. And I'm wondering why he draws the boundaries when there are so many Christians that wouldn't need in their faith the arguments for anything that Jonathan McLatchie and Lydia and Tim McGrew make. They would have it on faith, and they would say, look, it's not a provable thing, and that's been a common view of Christians that I've met,
and view of the majority group, the Catholics, which John pointed out.
But being what?
That Catholics don't have it as an article of faith. You can't be a Christian if you believe there's some unreliability in the Gospels.
Oh, I see. Yes, when it comes to that, and like us, I mean, that inerrancy view, or near close to it view that they have, doesn't seem to be attested throughout church history in many ways. I mean, you might be able to find a strand of people that always thought like that, but again, there was obviously masses that didn't, and I've known many Christians to this day who do not have. They're just like the Christians that Josh and John are. And so if you're suddenly putting them outside of the bounds, what is making your boundary? Did you see the note I put in the notes on this?
Go ahead with that.
Yeah, this was interesting because it's just like when I'm very much attuned to this boundary business where people put bounds on stuff. Well, the fact remains, it seems that one of the people that supports a lot of the stuff that they do is the scholar who is a genuine scholar, evangelical one called Peter J. Williams. Now, he is a young earth creationist. Now, I had this from Justin on Unbelievable Show, and when we talked after I was on once, and Justin was saying that he was quite shocked to find out in from what I understood, personal conversation with Peter J. Williams, that he was a young earth creationist. Justin was in shock, because of course Justin doesn't take that view and doesn't really think highly, I don't think, of young earth creationism. But the tenets of young earth creationism often argue that those that hold old earth views, and particularly theistic evolutionists, but even ID old earthers like Jonathan McLatchie is, that in fact the reality is it undermines even the very need for Jesus to be to die and be raised from the death. And so some young earth creationists do see, well, they wouldn't say other people are non-Christians, but they would say you've just undermined the entire faith by what you believe. That's like Peter saying to Jonathan, if I could get them two to talk, Peter, do you think Jonathan is undermining the tenets of the faith in his old earth views? Wow. Now I would like to see that.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that what Jonathan is critiquing Josh for is exactly what a young Earth creationist would critique him on.
And so
Yeah.
then you'd say, well, we agree to differ and we're all, but it's the resurrection. You see, you believe in the resurrection. Yeah, but they say that you've got no real reason for the resurrection if you believe in old Earth and millions of years of suffering. And so I'm just thinking, okay, let's widen your boundaries and let's not get, they've already said Dale Allison is not a Christian by their standards, and I'm thinking gosh. Can you do that?
Jonathan McLatchie, I think in one of his articles, uses this interesting phrase that he refers to John and Josh as professing Christians, atheistic tendencies. It just sounds like they've got a disease, these fideistic tendencies.
Well, it sounds to me close to sheep in wolves' clothing. No, Or was it wolves in sheep's clothing? No, which way is it?
Yes.
A wolf in sheep's clothing.
Sheep's clothing.
Yeah, they're wolves in sheep's clothing.
And just to round this off, he says, how can they make a robust argument for Jesus' resurrection? And therefore, the basis they affirm the truth of Christianity. Well, I can imagine, early Christians in Corinth or Thessalonica or something, miles away from Jerusalem. How could they make a robust argument for Jesus' resurrection? All they could say is, "Well, I was told it."
Yeah, well, it's a bit worse than that, isn't it? Because in Corinthians, Paul is saying to them, they're saying, some of the Christians were saying, well, there is no sort of future resurrection. And Paul is to say, oh, come on, because Jesus died and raised again, there is no resurrection, of the rest of everyone else. And or some of them. But these were Christians he was talking to. He said, well, okay, clearly you're not Christians. We've put you outside the boundary. But no, he was just trying to give them more information on their faith. And they were sort of going down a wrong road of their thinking. But I don't get the idea from Corinthians that they weren't Christians. And yet they didn't even believe in the future. They didn't seem to believe in the future resurrection of unbelievers and how it linked to Jesus' resurrection. And so, let alone the debate on what kind of body this is going to be anyway, with the complexity of Paul's language. And so, I just see problems straight away. Once you start getting this nitpicky and making it everything, you're then undercutting so many historical Christians who was trying to even understand who Jesus was in the early days, so in the first place.
Anyway,
okay,
so let's get our teeth stuck into it. So
yes,
firstly, they correctly report the overall contention of what Josh and John were telling us.
Yeah.
So I'll read that quote from the blog.
Yeah.
The podcast participants contended that we do not sufficiently engage with mainstream critical scholarship when developing our arguments for the high reliability of the Gospels. And so the response is also given in the blog. Well, there wasn't much actually response to that overall big picture critique, but the only thing I could find is when Jonathan talks about Lydia McGrew. Anybody want to quote from that?
Shall I do that bit again?
Okay.
Shall I read again? Okay.
Yeah.
So he says, that's Lydia McGrew, does not want to get distracted from the book's thesis by being sidetracked onto discussions of such things as alleged contradictions in the Gospels and proposed harmonizations. She covers this, in fact, in her more recent book, The Mirror or the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices.
There's as you were saying, Ed, there's so little here because it's almost a bit like that last bit that you just quoted, Francis, is a bit like we've just mentioned, just as a test case, setting aside critical scholarship. And now it's, don't look over there, look over here. I don't want to get distracted by contradictions and all the stuff. It hasn't even gone back to how about engaging. And what I've not seen is what Josh actually said. I've not seen, and maybe Jonathan can come back and say, yep, they're all here. I've not seen the critical takedown of the last 150 years of all aspects of gospel studies in terms of, look, we've talked about on this podcast, tropes, rewrites, Old Testament allusions, theology being written, relocating things, changing the order of stuff. All of that would need to be taken down first and that's true setting aside. Here, it's like, we'll just ignore them and we're going to go a different route as if it never happened. And that's what they seem to be giving the idea. This never happened. The road forked wrong 150 years ago, and we are saying they've just gone down the wrong road. Just trust us. That's what they seem to be saying. Just trust us. It's reportage. It's as simple as that. So
the next problem that came up in show one was that the synoptic problem was ignored. And this is, I think, he does respond to it because he talks about redaction. And because, in my view, the synoptic problem and redaction all connected. But this is all getting a bit technical. And can you help us here, Andrew?
On this? Well, I mean, this is what I've said, I think, possibly even in the very first episode we have with Jonathan McLatchie, where we focused on the feeding of the 5,000 of what is called the undesigned coincidences. But I was wanting to step back further. And I think I brought it up in the last episode. I touched into it, and I'll bring it up again here. And it touches into exactly what you just said, Ed, that William Paley was the person that first sort of robustly, I suppose, put these ideas together. And this was way before what was called the synoptic-problem, or as Jonathan likes to say, the synoptic-puzzle, because you don't want to have a problem. As I've thought long on this, even James Blunt, when he was his first book came out, the synoptic, it hadn't really even got off the ground in terms of exactly what scholars today, even evangelical mainstream scholars, would agree that that Matthew copied 90% of Mark, and Luke copied a massive amount of Mark, and that they, and nowadays it's moving towards maybe there's no Q, but certainly that John knew them. And so that's a great move, even in the time I've been alive. And so I would say that Jonathan, when he came to our group, and I've said this before, he should have started off by saying, this argument, this is what undesigned coincidences are. Now, if you put the question out to the audience and say, now, if everything was independent, and they made their independent arguments as eyewitnesses, and they were writing it down in reportage style, that would be amazing. Now, if you told your audience that actually, let me tell you now, one of them copied the other one 90% across, and they were redacting and changing, and they were doing changes to it, wouldn't that quell the whole thing in terms of you feel cheated if he didn't tell the audience that? And when I've watched his videos, he doesn't do that. And because to me, it changes everything. It changes. I mean, Francis, if a court case thing came up where you were meant to be doing two eyewitnesses, but then suddenly you realized one of them had literally read the entire other witness statement and then just sort of added a few things, what would you think?
I mean, it would certainly call into question how much having somebody else say the same thing assisted. I mean, when I started in the law, it was standard procedure for police officers to make their notebooks up together. They would go together. I mean, and this was quite, there's nothing underhand about this, but as people said, it meant that the fact that the two officers had put their heads together to come up with one account did mean that you couldn't really say it was one corroborated the other. Sorry, I don't know if that was...
Yeah, I get that.
No, that's right. Because they deliberately sat down and sort of with a view to creating a single consistent account. So they both, and the thing was, at the time, I suppose from those things where you're all so used to it, nobody thought, ooh, wouldn't it be a better idea if they each did their account separately? Nobody thought of that at the time. But I mean, it was just, but there we are, things change.
I mean, I honestly think if William Paley and then Blunt suddenly sat down with the scholars that really spend their lives on the synoptic so-called puzzle past their work, and sat down and said to William Paley, do you realize we've discovered now that the author of Matthew copied verbatim 90% or verbatim very, very large chunks, word for word, of Mark? And William Paley would probably, I would imagine, would go, personally, oh my gosh, that completely undermines my entire field of what I've been trying to do, because they knew each other, they're copying each other. And it gets worse because it isn't a collusion of where they're trying to get the same story. It's actually, if Matthew is copying Mark and you can demonstrate that he's making changes, and to the story he's written, making it better, dropping out this, adding this, maybe twisting that a little bit or relocating something, you would say that that's not actually colluding. This is more akin, is the way I see it. It's more akin to rewriting a script for a movie. And you're saying, no, we need to have a better thing here. It doesn't look so good. We do have a better ending. Now I know that does seem to undermine faith maybe, but that's not my problem. If that's what you're discovering is happening, that it's more like rewriting scripts than it is actually reportage. So Jonathan's first thing, and Lydia and Tim, they have to take down every aspect of the synoptic people that are experts in that field first. Then you can say, right, now we're going back. They were all wrong. It's now reportage. And now, wouldn't you know it, there are amazing undesigned coincidences. Plus, a book full of apparent contradictions, because they admit that. And that's why I gave you, did you see the book I sent you, that copy of? I wanted to bring that up. It's Gleason Archer wrote a book called The Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties. Now,
we'll come on to that.
That really ties into this, because this has to go side by side with so-called undesigned coincidences. Anyway, so that would be my thing about...
Yeah, we've got a section later on where we compare contradictions against undesigned
coincidences. Excellent.
Yeah, so we'll talk about it more then.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to read a quote. This is from the most recent blog from Jonathan, but it is actually quoting something from Lydia McGrew from prior this exchange. And there's a key phrase, source and redaction criticism, there in the middle of the quote. And so what she's talking about there is what we've just been discussing. The source is the idea of Matthew using Mark and all those sorts of things, including the hint that John probably had access to the other Gospels, but we're not sure. And then redaction is looking at what the changes, say, Matthew makes as he uses and edits Mark, trying to see what his purposes are, see if there's consistent themes in the way that he does his edits. That's what redaction criticism is. Okay, so here we go. Lydia McGrew saying, I'm suggesting that the reader consider the question of the historical reliability of the Gospels and of Acts from a new angle. Instead of getting involved in the specifics of alleged contradictions and possible resolutions to them, she's instead of tackling those books, that's the Gospels, from those perspectives, it's from the perspective of a source and redaction criticism, with the assumption that they represent multiple redactors, layers, and developments. So that's what she's saying. She is ignoring.
We're going to set aside.
Saying, setting that aside. Instead of thinking and speaking of Jesus or Paul as if they're literary characters in fictional works, I suggest that the reader takes seriously the hypothesis that they are what they appear to be prima facie, and what they were traditionally taken by Christians to be: historical memoirs of real people and events, written by those in a position to know about these people and events, either direct eyewitnesses or friends and associates of eyewitnesses who were trying to be truthful. I suggest that we take this hypothesis for a test drive while setting aside the apparatus of critical scholarship. So basically, it's saying exactly what Josh and John are critiquing them for.
We could turn the phrase around, and that's what Josh and John, we can set aside undesigned coincidences on the basis of serious critical scholarship. So and that's, they're just sort of like, again, setting aside, I can understand it as a test case, but you can't, unless they think the test case undermines the entire last 150 years, and they come out and say that, then you've got to deal with the 150 years. You can't just, as they do, launch into them with their audience knowing nothing of the past 150 years. That I find that insulting, to be honest, to the intelligence of people.
And the idea that you have to consider Jesus and Paul as literary characters in fictional works to be undertaking literary and redaction criticism, that sort of thing, is ridiculous. Yes. All we need to say is they're not reliable, that they're not complete, true, honest post-Enlightenment historiography. They are
developed,
Yeah.
And some of it's myth making and some of it's probably kernels of what happened. And then there's embellishments and changes. Did you notice something? I noticed this instantly, and I don't know if you noticed it if you're in reading Jonathan McLatchie's response, but in exactly what we're talking about, in setting aside critical scholarship, he was trying to make an argument. And I've got a quote from him here on this is the revamped, I think, response. And he said he actually used a little bit of critical scholarship here without actually telling anyone about why he accepts it and hasn't set this aside. But that's because it was useful for his argument, you see, and this is what he's doing. He goes, although Matthew 14:13-21 does narrate the feeding of the 5,000, no mention is made of Bethsaida. We'll get to this later, but the point I'm making, he goes, furthermore, Matthew, who often arranged his material thematically rather than chronologically, gives his account of the feeding of the 5,000 some 3 chapters subsequent. Anyway, it goes on to the point that in order for Jonathan to make his case, he needs Matthew to actually have a bit of critical scholarship here, which means you can change things, not as reportage would be, presumably. You wouldn't normally report things and report the last thing first and then give the impression that the order was different. This is thematic, not necessarily chronological. But that's a bit of scholarship going on there. We found this out through scholarship. It wasn't just because you can read Matthew and go, oh, he's either wrong. No, in order to not be wrong, you say he thematically rearranged things. That's stepping into our territory, Jonathan. That is stepping into our territory. And I don't know if you picked up on that.
Yeah, I did actually, but I'm glad you have, because I then dropped it again. Yeah. Okay, so I'm kind of carrying on through this. So Jonathan also says that in her book, McGrew was trying to appeal to a particular audience, one capable of seeing the direct appeal of undesigned coincidences. Well, that rings a few alarm bells.
Yes, not a room full of scholars. Yeah.
It sounds like he's completely, yes, exactly, stepping outside of any critical scholarship altogether. And then for that purpose and for the length of the book, taking a significant detour to discuss all those theories, which are addressed in plenty of other books, would bog down the argument.
Kind of reminds me of Ken Ham, who goes straight to the children. To teach everything about young earthism, because rather than actually through peer-reviewed scientific journals and stuff like that, if you ever could. And this is it. Their audience is going to already be bypassing scholarship, and yet Jonathan knows about it, but it seems to me that he's not going to address it with that audience because they're already thinking in this sort of reportage way anyway. You just need someone to back up that view who sounds intelligent and to go, great, who needs all this scholarship? There must be the devil anyway, So, so that audience is a very key admission, I feel. Yeah.
To be fair to Jonathan, he does say that Lydia's book does show awareness of theories such as the two-source hypothesis. That's what we've been talking about.
Yes.
But he then doesn't fill that out at all in that paragraph. So all we can do is either read the book ourselves, which I don't think any of us have, or see how that kind of plays out in the details he carries on with further down the blog.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read the book, but I do want to be fair to Jonathan, and I think, and perhaps to the extent that I can be fair to her, not having read her book, be fair to Lydia. I mean, I think the idea is that they are focusing on one particular aspect of how you might put a case together, and they are suggesting, well, let's, the phrase, run this up the flagpole, see if anyone salutes it. But it's just sort of, does this model work? Let's look at this model. Does this model work? I mean, I think that's where they're coming from on this.
Yes. I mean, I read some of that book way back when it first came out. I think John Nelson lent me a copy of it, but I've mainly sort of watched videos from Jonathan and Lydia. As a matter of fact, I've recently been watching Lydia's recent YouTube channel ones on her particular takedown, in her view, of editorial fatigue. And so, but I've also watched this YouTube channel Testify, on them and lots of other videos of this over the years. And so I've been pretty, the things that come up in the book will no doubt be coming up in these videos. And so, it's like I'm very aware of this view and its sources and everything else, along with talking with John Nelson a lot back in the day on it. But yeah, so before Jonathan comes back and says, well, you haven't even read the book, you're not even, I think we've all got a grasp of this by researching their arguments in terms of other avenues.
Can we go on to the next one? Okay, so this is that they were sort of the same sort of theme, that the McGrews are not being scholars in their method, just in their overall approach. Basically, it's all about bias they were talking about, and they pick this out particularly in the way that they use this military language in talking about their apologetics and just giving Christians information. Do you remember that? Oh, okay. So I listened to it all again because I have to apologize actually because I missed a lot of it originally because of my feed dropped off because I was in Pakistan.
That's right. That? Yes, it did drop off. Yeah. I'd have to.
So they were talking about the way Christians are let down when they're teenagers, and they just get sort of the fluffy stuff, and they're not given solid, robust apologetics arguments. And so they're like sent to war with plastic guns and plastic shields.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
So there's a lot that was one of an example of 2 or 3 where they said gave the McGrews using military language to discuss apologetics. So this isn't kind of on the one hand, on the other. And there was a brilliant quote from John who said, if you're in a war, you're unlikely to be thinking straight. It kind of, it makes you binary, and it just makes your mind, all that adrenaline in your body stops you thinking in a relaxed, critical, on the one hand, on the other, let's try and get a good final take on this. So here is the quote.
Okay, shall I?
Yep, great.
Shall I do that again? I'm not doing much talking. He says, in the Doubts Aloud podcast, Josh responded, I think we have to remember they're claiming to be unbiased historians here. They're just unbiased historians, and they are looking at the evidence in an unbiased way. If we are unbiased historians, we know that this kind of thing happens across Second Temple Jewish literature. It happens all the time. Thus, we're not treating this like a secular text anymore. We're letting our existing commitments drive out our scholarship. Josh seems to have quite a naive view of how historians approach ancient texts, and for that matter, how scholars approach any matter. Nobody approaches an inquiry with a completely blank slate without any background assumptions. I have never claimed to be an unbiased historian. Bias is unavoidable since nobody approaches any of these questions in a vacuum.
Well, I forget where they say it, that there's this sort of binary thinking. That either you're with us or you're against us, kind of thing, and sort of being together, seeking truth, isn't to get an aim. Actually, that reminds me of something else. John said last time, which was brilliant. He said, speaking as a Christian, all truth is God's truth. So he just wants to find out the truth, and that's God's truth, whatever it is. Whereas here, he's leaning into his bias.
I don't know. Is he leaning into it, or is he just acknowledging it? I mean, I think I might draw a comparison with prejudice or racism. Because quite often, if you go to any workshop on stereotypes and racism, the fact is we do all have stereotypes. So what we need to do is not say, oh, I don't have any stereotypes, I just treat people as I find them, I never have any preconceptions. Whereas what you should do is acknowledge, I do have stereotypes, I know I have stereotypes, so by having that knowledge, I'm going to try to be more aware that I'm not allowing the stereotypes I have about people to influence me. It's a confirmation bias is basically what it's about. We all have to acknowledge we do have confirmation bias, but the best way to fight confirmation bias is by acknowledging you've got it.
Yes, I certainly agree with that. And that is what we're all seeking to do.
Yes.
Well, it's what scholars are seeking to do. We're not actual scholars ourselves. We're just reporting what people are saying. But so they try to sort of minimize their bias and be aware of it. And Dale Allison is a fantastic example of that, as was they quoted him and talked about him. But what's happening here is they're saying, look, Josh is wrong when he says we shouldn't be treating this like a secular text. Well, no, Josh is saying we should treat the New Testament like a secular text because that's taking out our obvious bias. We know there's a bias that we think that the Bible is superior to secular texts. But if we're trying to minimize that bias, we will seek to treat them the same and with the same kind of scholarship. And yet Jonathan is saying, no. We've all got bias. Let's just sort of celebrate it and go with it.
But I suppose you could argue that what is Jonathan actually really saying here? Because acknowledging bias, like a lot of scholars, like critical scholars who are Christian or who've become more liberal Christian, they started off with perhaps an evangelical inerrancy bias, looked at the evidence which slowly challenged them and slowly led them to change their view on inerrancy of the Bible. And therefore, they learned to set aside their bias by the evidence, and Jonathan should be doing the same thing. Is he just saying that actually I'll set aside my bias, but it's there? So historians need to set aside their bias and look at it without having a worldview that has a conclusion first. But I don't actually see that in a lot of Jonathan's work. I see that there's clearly the conclusion is a faith, a boundary of doctrine and religious dogma, and most of that which he already accepts just needs to get evidence to support that, rather than it's unthinkable to say, oh, if I find evidence against it, and Jonathan would probably say this, if I found evidence against it, I'd go that way. I don't think so. There's too much at stake with a faith belief. I've seen it before in other Christians. There's too much at stake in your family, your ministry, your job. You don't just give it all up based on simple evidence. And so faith belief bias is far stronger effect, in my view, than it is on a secular biases, whatever those secular biases might be. I mean, what would a secular bias be, for example?
Well,
Trumpism.
Yeah, a political bias or...
No. In looking at the evidences, say, for resurrection and all these issues.
Oh, I see. Well, you could have a secular bias because you get, I mean, you could
say
approach Gospels in a way that, I've already decided that then they're not good enough, and therefore somebody comes up to me with an argument of saying, oh, they're actually pretty reliable, pretty sound. I'm going to be like, I'm going to be approaching it. I mean, no,
so the criticism to you,
you're speaking personally. You're speaking.
Yes.
Personally.
Oh, yes, I am. Yes.
But you're not a scholar. If you were a scholar, you would try to put that on one side.
I would try.
Yes,
but I think it would be important as a scholar for me to acknowledge that, like I say, we all have our confirmation biases and we have to struggle with them. We always have to be alert.
Yeah. And that's what maybe Jonathan is giving the best credit, is it just saying we all have the confirmation bias. And then you need other people to actually pick that apart. So their audience, by the way, is not the best other people for them to be doing this with.
Yeah, I agree with that.
They need to do it with an audience that can be, I mean, we're lay people in one sense. I mean, I have studied theology at Spurgeon's Bible College, but I've read a lot over the years. We're maybe in slightly better grounds than the average churchgoer to deal with what Jonathan's saying. But they need to, Jonathan should sit down with the Dale Allisons of this world, if that was ever possible, and literally do your stuff from the front and then be torn apart by expert scholarship, because that's what I feel would happen to him if he did that. But their audience is not that group. They can criticize that group, but not actually necessarily stand in front of them. Although Jonathan will probably come back and say, well, I would do it if they accepted me to speak. But would they accept him? to even speak, but that's where it should be happening. Then I'd be impressed if he could hold his own with those people.
But to me, the first minimum thing you can do to address your bias is to say, okay, for the sake of my scholarship, I'm going to treat these as ancient texts on an equivalent level playing field to other ancient texts which aren't in the New Testament.
Yeah, and look at the Quran in the same way, and a Quranic scholar should try to look at the Bible in a way that he doesn't personally view the Bible like he views the Quran, but should still approach it the same way and lay it aside. But I've actually got something from Jonathan that of all the things I've not found very helpful that Jonathan has said, and I feel I can see the apologetics coming out over evidence. He did say one thing that I think he was quite upfront. And it was about the dating of Daniel. And I've got the quote here. And he was actually quite upfront about this. He was going, let me see, this is his article on reviewing the dating of Daniel. Jonathan McLatchie writes, the dating of Daniel's prophecies carries high stakes for both sides of the debate concerning the veracity of Christianity. If the book of Daniel can be robustly shown to be composed before the events that the prophecies forecast, this would constitute significant evidence in confirmation of Christianity, since specificity and accuracy of Daniel's predictions are significantly more probable given the truth of Christianity than it is a falsehood. So basically, I think he's saying he is acknowledging, which is strange, by the way, because there are evangelicals that accept a late date and it doesn't knock their faith. He seems to be saying that actually a late date would be significant evidence against the confirmation of Christianity on the book of Daniel being written late. That's how I read what he's saying. But at least that's an admission, isn't it? He's saying there's something at stake here. But really, if you were looking at the evidence for Daniel, you'd want to lay that aside and say, well, look, the fact is you don't want to come in there thinking we need to do our best to find confirmation that it is written early so that it doesn't cause a problem for Christianity. That, to me, is working wrongly with a bias. It would be set aside that. All right, so the evidence does seem to support a 2nd century date. Now reevaluate your faith, but don't do it the other way around.
We're going to run out of time. Look at the issue of editorial fatigue, which was brought up, and Jonathan has picked up and discussed. So there's a lot to unpick here. I think we've explained what undesigned coincidences are in the Gospels. I hope we have, and it certainly explained it in detail last episode.
Yeah, I think we've covered it.
You mean editorial fatigue or undesigned?
No, I mean undesigned coincidences. So there's a lot to unpick before we actually get to.
Yes.
So then, what we have is Luke and Mark both have the feeding of the 5,000, and does John, and there's an undesigned coincidence there. So should we first say what that is?
Yes, so the reason the 5,000 feeding the 5,000 comes up because it's argued that it's one of the best, from what I understanding, undesigned coincidences in terms of what's meant by that phrase. So I'll explain that. Ironically, it's also argued it's one of the best examples of what is called editorial gospel fatigue, which is really ironic because now you've got two views totally opposed to each other, which is why they would want to take it down. So so what you're asking, Ed, is to go through an example of the 5,000.
Just very quickly remind us of what the undesigned coincidence is.
So one of the ones that Jonathan seems to think is so powerful, and it sort of is enough to undermine again so much of traditional scholarship, is in fact this idea that the feeding of the 5,000 in Luke is set in the city or town of Bethsaida. And that's the comment from Luke. In John, doesn't mention where it is, this feeding of the 5,000, but he does narrate the feeding of the 5,000. Now, in that story in John, Jesus turns to Philip, and Philip, incidentally, is mentioned earlier in John as coming from Bethsaida. And so Jonathan would say, make so much of the idea that Jesus turns to Philip and says, where shall we buy food? And you go, oh my gosh, John doesn't say that it's in Bethsaida. Luke does. But John says Philip is from Bethsaida, and lo and behold, Jesus turns to the very person who lives there. Now, we actually, in the very first episode with Jonathan, plus the last one, went into this, particularly the first episode, in detail, saying there were so many problems linked with this whole story and setting to do with Mark and Matthew and all kinds of things that actually it doesn't stand scrutiny. But I came, funny enough, just as a little add-on here, I came up with something else that I don't think we've covered before on this, and I discovered this fairly recently. But how reliable is John anyway on where Philip came from? Because John, apparently, when he does mention that Philip's from Bethsaida, he actually says Andrew and Peter, it's their city. They came from the city of Bethsaida. But Mark and Matthew have the house of Andrew and Peter in Capernaum, where the mother-in-law lives. It's obviously a house. It's where they live. They say nothing about Andrew and Peter coming from the city from Bethsaida. So why there? You've got a classic contradiction that people have spilt ink on trying to solve. Who's accurate here? Is John actually inaccurate about where Andrew, Peter, and therefore he could be inaccurate about where Philip came from? To me, this is something that you'd have to settle even before you started the argument that Jonathan's trying to make. Anyway, that's my sum up of the undesigned coincidence.
Good. Right. Now, in parallel with that, there's the editorial fatigue issue. And there, Mark doesn't say it was in Bethsaida. Mark says it was in a desolate place. And Luke, and Mark also says that immediately after the feeding, that Jesus instructs the disciples to cross the Sea of Galilee to Bethsaida. So they're the opposite shore to Bethsaida in Mark, according to that verse. There's a complication to come, but just according to that verse, it is anywhere but Bethsaida. And so Luke, for some reason, decides to locate it in Bethsaida, even though Mark says it's the opposite. And he starts, and Bethsaida is a city or a town, depending on your translation. And then Luke forgets that he's moved it to a town and calls it a desolate place. So
copying almost word for word of what's in Mark.
Yes. So Mark Goodacre, who came across this, or first, I think it was his notice, saying, look, Luke is clearly copying Mark, and he's then forgotten how he's changed it in his editorial at the start of the passage, and very quickly forgets that. And so he seemed to say that Bethsaida is a desolate place when it's a city or a town. That is an example of editorial fatigue. And that is something that is a critique of the whole undesigned coincidences generally, that it ignores things like editorial fatigue, which is, I guess, about, late 20th century, because of Mark Goodacre, I think, wrote about it in about 1990 or in the 1980s.
Yeah, I think he was, though, building up from somebody called Goulding, another scholar.
Right.
Who sort of really talked about it. And then he sort of, I think Mark Goodacre is more popularizing it. He's a bit like the equivalent to James Blunt on William Paley.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So then we've got two issues to take into account now. If we're going to kind of see this clash of two whole issues, undesigned coincidences and editorial fatigue. The first thing is basically, forget about the fatigue for a moment, that the undesigned coincidence requires the 5,000 miracle to have occurred in Bethsaida for it to be a coincidence. And that is factually not the case, because the first source we have is Mark, who places it anywhere but Bethsaida, on the other shore of the of Galilee, and so it's only subsequently that by mistake Bethsaida was said to be the location. So what does Jonathan make of that? He has to explain why this to Bethsaida thing, crossing over to Bethsaida, is not in fact the case. And what he does is he picks up an apparent contradiction in Mark's account here, because what happens is Jesus sends them off. Then by the middle of the night, they are struggling against the wind in the middle of the lake, and Jesus is still praying on the mountainside. And then when it gets towards dawn, Jesus walks across the water, the walking on water miracle, and seems to go past. And then, of course, he gets in, and then they complete the journey, and they finish up in this place, Gennesaret. And if you look at the map, Gennesaret is actually not opposite. It is opposite Bethsaida. So it's completely confusing. You're at a place which isn't Bethsaida, and at the beginning of Mark's account, and he says cross over to Bethsaida, and then when he finishes the narrative, he ends up at Gennesaret, which is opposite Bethsaida. So it's a complete contradiction within Mark.
Yes, and that's a good reason for why they suddenly changed direction or whatever. Or you're going to have to admit to an error in the Bible, and then how reliable are we talking?
Yes, so you kind of have to choose which contradiction you're going to accept and which contradiction you're going
to or even error. Yeah, exactly. So you could say, okay, isn't it amazing that he turned to Philip and he's from Bethsaida? Wow, the truth that Jesus fed 5,000 people plus women and children, all from 2 loaves and 2 fish, must be true. Okay, so Mark made an error here. He actually got the location wrong. What you're saying, Ed, would have been so easy if Luke had just said they withdrew to a place called Capernaum, or that Mark had said to go opposite to Gennesaret instead of mentioning Bethsaida. Both ways would have been a far better so-called attested eyewitness memory of, you know what I mean? At this moment, Jonathan is over one hand going, he turns to Philip, wow, believe in Jesus, basically. Mark, probably got it wrong, maybe. I don't really know.
So how does he solve all of this? He says that the journey started near Bethsaida, so not in the city itself, but kind of in the environment of Bethsaida. And he was telling them when cross over to Bethsaida, he meant to go past it, not even though it's on this bank. So that's a weird say. It's not to Bethsaida, it's past it. But again, he's making the Greek change its thing. So thinking that has now solved that problem, that they are starting their Bethsaida and just going past it and ending up on the opposite side. So he solves that. But then he's got to deal with, why does it say to Bethsaida? And he rejects Lydia McGrew's attempt at making the Greek mean the opposite of what it says, as translated. But he's saying, no, that's untenable. He looked at other passages where the Greek is used in the New Testament and other contemporary Greek documents. So that doesn't go. So he's got 2 ways of solving this other problem. One is, he says that it could have been towards, so the same issue, which he doesn't really like. He says a further option, and one that I lean towards, is that Mark's source, quite plausibly, the Apostle Peter, mistook a single word when reporting the event. So he's saying, yes, it is a contradiction, and it's an error, and there you go.
So on that basis, that Jonathan's admission, which is like a tiny little admission of an error there, why couldn't, in that case, John have Jesus just turn to another apostle just by chance, and it was wrong, and he really meant John or something? Do you know what I mean? It wasn't Philip. On the basis of that very simple statement, when he turns to John, or maybe someone misspoke about the green grass. That's another one, isn't it? Maybe he didn't say green. Someone else said that and misheard. And so,
yeah. Well, I think it's just astounding that he's trying to use undesigned coincidences to demonstrate the reliability of the Gospels. And then he's to actually maintain that argument, he has to say the Gospels aren't reliable at all. Peter mistook, and that got into the account.
Yeah, and he's already admitted thematic manipulation of the order of events in Matthew, for example. He's already admitted that. So why couldn't he just say, go the full hog and say that different gospel writers may want to relocate the story? for effect, even, which
Yeah.
is what some people say. He's already admitted part of this. So Matthew isn't chronological reportage. Now he's saying, Peter misspoke. He's assumed it's Peter by
Yeah.
some plausibility. I mean, he it's just, to me, I feel I can see right through what he's doing. I suppose we're entering in, though, in doing this with Jonathan, is literally trying to enter into the reportage model and obviously make points within an assumption that this is a test case of reportage and why you've got these issues. Because the reality is that on the other extreme of scholarship, none of this would even be considered as a conversation to have when you have rewrites, redactions, changes, edits, thematic things going on. Contradictions cease to be. I mean, my understanding is that the scholars think nothing of contradictions because it's exactly what you get if you're trying to make a reportage model of a whole books that aren't reportage models. So that's where you get into trouble. Yeah. A rewrite of a script, you don't say, my goodness, you had it set here, there in that first script, and now you've got it set here. What a contradiction. No, I'm changing the story, setting it in a better place for the audience or something. And so we're just entering here into his own world of reportage and coming up with these issues. Yeah.
And so we then get on to the second issue here, as the editorial fatigue clashes with Undesigned Coincidences, and that is that Jonathan wants to sort of take down the whole editorial fatigue issue itself, and this is one of its classic. This is one of the two classic cases of it that are easiest to talk about. And so the second thing is how he tries to show that the editorial fatigue is just nothing to see here. So I think it's useful to read the verse in Luke that Mark Goodacre says is the indication that there's fatigue going on. So does anyone want to read Luke 9:12?
Shall I read it again?
Thanks.
Yeah. Is everybody happy with that?
Yeah.
So it says, now the day began to wear away, and the 12 came and said to him, send the crowd away to go to the surrounding villages and countryside to find lodging and get provisions, for we are here in a desolate place.
So there's potentially two issues here. The first is, if they're in Bethsaida, why is Luke suggesting that they need to go out into the surrounding countryside to get food and lodging when they're in a city? And isn't that where you get food and lodging? And the second thing is, how can you describe a city, Bethsaida, as a desolate place? And so Jonathan responds directly on this point. And shall I read it? Because I haven't done my turn yet recently.
Okay, go on then.
This argument, in my opinion, is exceedingly weak. Goodacre has succeeded in creating a problem where there isn't one. The disciples' statement concerning the surrounding places where the people could go to purchase food indicates that the desolate place was not far from those surrounding villages and countryside. As stated previously, the location of Bethsaida is being used in a regional sense. The most natural way of reading Luke's account, and furthermore, Matthew, which most scholars agree was independent of Luke, though utilizing at times a common source material, also indicates that they were in a desolate place. Before we move on, what do you make of that, particularly this thing about Matthew?
I don't know. Do we need to read the verse in Matthew? What did Matthew say?
Well, he's making a point that Matthew is a colluding document, but all Mark Goodacre is saying is that, well, Matthew hasn't chosen to editorialize, so there's no fatigue for that, and Luke is, so Luke's the one who's getting into tension here.
So it's Luke who puts it in Bethsaida, and Matthew just says it's a desolate place. Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, yes. I mean, that I don't find I
There's
don't
an
find.
additional thing that I discovered, that Luke actually doesn't actually mention anything about boats and seas and coasts and things. It's just simply he sets it within the city or town of Bethsaida, and then just goes on with the thing, with the actual miracle of feeding 5,000 people. And it isn't he completely drops anything to do with boats, and which is interesting because John doesn't, and has boats and things in there, and coast. But on the map, apparently Bethsaida in its city or town is actually offset from the coast a little bit. It's not like coastal stuff in terms of it's near it. But that Jonathan's trying to have his cake and eat it by saying the text says they withdrew to a city called Bethsaida. And then Jonathan's saying to the audience, they didn't go in the city. It's obviously outside somewhere in a very desolate place. Now, that's not actually in the text of Luke. That's something that Jonathan's reading into it based on trying to sort of see how it could logistically happen. And then he goes on. Did you read that bit? Does Goodacre believe that Luke thought
No,
the
you
town
read
of
that
Beth?
bit. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. This is where I listened to Lydia McGrew's rebuttal on this, and it's an interesting rebuttal, which I have a totally different take with, because it takes you down into another rabbit warren of logistics. Okay, because they're seeing it as almost as if this is reporting some kind of I don't know, London March or something, and trying to sort of logistically work out how many people could get. So when we're talking about a miracle story here that most people would probably laugh at,
Yeah.
in reality, and yet they're talking about it as if it was like a London March. That wouldn't people laugh at? You would just sort of want to talk about it. So she says, does Goodacre believe that Luke thought the town of Bethsaida as being capable of accommodating a crowd of 5,000 people, all sitting down together and being fed in a large open area? Very good point on a very logistical, particularly how big is this town? And I'm not sure. City or town or whatever. Is it possible that 5,000 men plus women and children, just argue 10,000 maybe, could be there? Can they all be in the city? Can they all buy food? The question, that's a very good point on a literalistic logistic level, which I hadn't thought about before. But what does that make you feel like when you hear something like that?
Well, it's not true to the text, because the text says send the crowd away to the surrounding villages and countryside. But if they're in the town, they'd say into the town and the surrounding villages and countryside.
I mean, what does he mean? What does it mean to say that it's being used in a regional sense?
Oh,
I'm not sure what. I don't know enough about the way villages or areas were described to say whether there was
it's like where I am,
the
town of Lewisham and the borough of Lewisham. Yeah. So we withdrew to the town of Lewisham, and I have a particular picture because I live there of what that means. And if someone said I withdrew to the borough of Lewisham, it could be in many, many other places in a far wider regional aspect. He's trying to make that argument. Where the text doesn't actually do. He says they withdrew to the town of Bethsaida. And you'd have to say, okay, so is the town of Bethsaida a double thing in that culture? Did it mean this big in a wider sense, and did it mean this much shops and town in a lower sense? He's trying to make, again, it's not in the text. He's trying to say that must be the case. Why? Because you generally have to have eyewitness reliability. He's going to say, okay, it's in Bethsaida and it's out Bethsaida of the town. It's in a desolate place outside, but it's in Bethsaida in some sense. And that's not the way, particularly when he drops out anything to do with boats and seas and then walking along the coast and trying to follow him. It completely makes you think that there's nothing to do with the sea in Luke, which is an interesting thing that he doesn't mention. And that's Luke completely resettling it in a way. But what about this logistical thing? This idea that 12,000 or 10,000 people in time, say it's a small town. Could you really feed? My first thought was, of course, it's going to be an embellished story. You've already got an Old Testament one that's very similar of 100 people. So Jesus is going to be greater than that story. If it's a rewrite, then it raises other questions. If Jesus is actually doing it, then somebody's going to say it's 5,000 people. If it was 5,000 in the Old Testament, it would be 20,000 people. And Luke is not thinking of how could this literally happen in a particular town. I don't think the idea is this miracle. They weren't really going to buy anything. Jesus knows what he was going to do, and it's a story of multiplication of food, for those that need it. I think logistically trying to think how you can all be in Bethsaida and do this. So therefore it must have been in some sort of amazing place miles outside. Is just trying to mess about with reportage that it's not a reportage story as far as I'm concerned, you know. So that's how I would answer that.
So let's crack on.
Yeah.
And then the next one I want to pick up on is how John and Josh were saying the bar for accepting an undesigned coincidence compared to the bar for accepting a contradiction. They seem to be a kind of clash of kind of bias almost there, that it's easy to accept an undesigned coincidence and really difficult to accept a contradiction. So that the blog doesn't really address that point, but I think we want to, probably as a way of finishing off, because this is getting over time soon. So there's a certain number of undesigned coincidences and a certain number of contradictions that are talked about. So this is where your book comes in, Andrew, that you want to talk about.
Yes. I remember this book years ago that somebody mentioned, and it was really ironic that somebody like Gleason Archer has done a book called The Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, because it's kind of an admission of something. It's like an encyclopedia, you know, not 10 passages that we find difficult over the years, you know, encyclopedia of Bible difficulties. You've got an so-called inspired inerrant word of God, which actually leads fundamentalists and evangelicals to realize that inspired word of God actually apparently, because there are any apparent contradictions, apparently reads in contradictory sense. My feeling is that when you've got that going on, as much as you might want to laud an undesigned coincidences that isn't this amazing, deal with the apparent contradictions. How can it be so amazing when not many people even spot undesigned coincidences, but they do spot the apparent contradictions and find it a problem? How can you just set aside that and then think, but you know, it's like you said, Mark said, go across the lake to Bethsaida. Don't look at that. Look at this. Jesus turned to Philip and he was from Bethsaida. And that settles it. It's almost like it crosses to me, they cancel each other out and say the reportage model is not very good because contradictions form part of the reportage model. They don't form part of a rewrite and rescripting of narratives. That's why they don't worry about contradictions. Scholars, they don't worry about contradictions. They don't say, I'm fretting over this contradiction. They've rewritten it. That's why it's apparent contradiction, because it's just a rewrite of a script. And I just take it like that. Now, if I was a Christian, I would embrace that model somehow with my faith, but not this reportage model, because of things like an encyclopedia. So what would be your views on a book called by that title?
Well, I would. It's like Rishi Sunak admitting he's lost the election.
Oh, meaning what? Sorry.
Well, it's just admitting that you've lost already.
It's conceding. It's conceding the point. Yes, you know, the fact that you have produced and what you produce is of encyclopedic length. You know, that it is really rather an own goal, I suppose.
Yeah. Anyway, I really want to hear from Francis before we have to finish, because in the blog there was a hint that there was particularly Palian people at the beginning were using courtroom kind of style arguments, and of course Francis can tell us about the issue of contradictions and on the one hand and coincidences on the other, and how are they symmetrical opposites, and how they all relate to each other in court. So Francis got quite a material on this. Yeah,
well, you set out in the show notes for us to use 3 questions to think about, Ed. So perhaps I can just sort of read out those questions and give my answer to each one, if that isn't too much of a sort of like pulling the veil
quick
aside.
And then you can spend more time on your material from Hanratty.
Yeah, okay. So first you asked, would the contradictions or the undesigned coincidences carry more weight for the court? And I'm going to give a typical lawyer's answer, which is say it all depends. No specific answer. Each case turns on its own facts, and it's a question of fact and degree, which is not a very satisfactory answer. It's one that we do have to give to people all the time because each case is different. But it depends. The weight you attach to an undesigned coincidence as opposed to a contradiction would just depend on how much of a contradiction it is and how compelling the undesigned coincidence is. And then you made a point. There seems to be a sliding scale for undesigned coincidences. If the coincidence is compelling in the evidence it provides, and it's not going to be an obscure nuance in the accounts, and so collusion, a designed coincidence, will be in play as a possibility, and if there's a compelling coincidence. So yes, I think you're absolutely right about that it's got to be sufficiently impactful that it does take the question of how you decide the case further. But if it's that impactful, it's unlikely to have gone unnoticed and therefore more, can raise more of a suspicion of collusion. It's rather the catch-22 that I remember somebody who wrote an article I read about reincarnation, that in reincarnation, accounts given of people who say they've been reincarnated, the only way you can test them is if what they say can be found in history. So if your historical research can show that what they said is in fact the case, that supports it. But on the other hand, if historical research supports it, then it's more likely that they will unconsciously or possibly consciously have come across that historical research and therefore been affected by it and used it to found their story. So it's a bit of a catch-22 situation. And then in what ways are the two issues of contradictions and undesigned coincidences symmetrical opposites? And in what ways are they different arguments that they can't be squared off against each other? I think to some extent that goes back to your first question. I think that it's a question of weight in each case. And I thought if people wanted to look at a case that involved contradictions and involved coincidences, and where in fact the final decision, which took place over 40 years after the case was originally heard, the final decision referred to the fact that the number of coincidences were so great and so compelling that it did lead, in that particular case, to a decision that they proved the case. And that was the case that some people, might depend on your age, have heard of it, will have heard of, and it's the case of Hanratty. And just very briefly, Hanratty was someone who was charged with the murder of a man called Michael Gregston, and the rape and attempted murder of Michael Gregston's lover, Valerie Story. He had effectively kidnapped them when they were parked up in a lover's lane type area because they were having an extramarital affair. He forced them at gunpoint to drive him around. He then eventually shot Michael Gregston, raped Valerie Story, pulled her out of the car, shot her several times, leaving her paralyzed for the rest of her life, and left her for dead. And he was convicted. He was hanged. He was almost one of the last people to be hanged before hanging was abolished. He insisted to the end that he was innocent, and his family, did what families do. They completely believed him, and they campaigned uphill and down Dale for his conviction, even after he was hanged, to be overturned. Hence, the case was heard in 2001, if I remember rightly, again in the Court of Appeal, when it was brought back for...
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, and there'd been another intervening Court of Appeal where they'd said, no, the right decision, we cannot overturn this decision. But the Court of Appeal in the hearing in 2002, which I don't think it's ever going to come back again, although they are still fighting. They're still fighting to say he was wrongly convicted. The Court of Appeal said in their judgment that Michael Sherard apparently he was the defence barrister at the original trial, opened the defence at trial by saying appositely that this was a case sagging with coincidences. And they said, just let us consider some of the more striking coincidences if James Hanratty was not guilty. He was wrongly identified by 3 witnesses at identification parades, first as the person at the scene of the crime, and secondly by 2 witnesses as driving a vehicle close to where the vehicle in which the murder was committed was found. He had the same identifying manner of speech as the killer. He stayed in a room the night before the crime from which bullets that had been fired from the murder weapon were recovered. The murder weapon was recovered from a place on a bus which he regarded as a hiding place, and the bus followed a route he could well have used. And one further coincidence, which they didn't mention, which was in the evidence of Valerie's story, was that he was driving quite. He was at this stage still being driven by Michael Gregston. It was obviously before Michael Gregston was murdered. And as Michael Gregston was coming around a corner of a particular part of London, he said, Hanratty said to him, "Be careful, there are roadworks here." And they got round the corner and there were roadworks. And Hanratty then said, "Oh, not that I live anywhere around here or know anything about it, of course." And he did. Although he didn't live there, his family lived there. So he would have been familiar with the area. And again, this was another thing that, Valerie's story, when she gave that evidence, couldn't have known that, but it was discovered. And there were a number of discrepancies on both sides, to be fair. There were some discrepancies in the prosecution evidence. There were quite a lot of discrepancies in Hanratty's evidence, especially as he chose to run a false alibi, which he then recanted and completely changed his alibi. So he started saying he was in Liverpool, that was his big alibi, and then changed it to saying he was in Rhyl. We'll put a link to a summary of the case in the show notes, and if anybody wants to go deeper into it and read the whole Court of Appeal decision, where they just said no, sorry, we cannot say that the jury's verdict was wrong, then there's another link to the full judgment on this contained in the summary, to which we'll link. But anyway, I think if people want to look at that and see, now that's an amass of coincidences from which a case was built where people very often couldn't have known the significance of what they were saying at the time, and yet it all dovetailed. So, and weigh that against Philip comes from Bethsaida, or, the grass was green, or, or whatever, and see what you think about whether that is even in the same league. Just make up your own minds.
Yeah. I get that completely. So the coincidences can definitely be a useful piece of evidence in court and generate strong, robust verdicts.
Yes. In fact, the end of that bit I quoted says the number of alleged coincidences means they are not coincidences, but overwhelming proof of the safety of the conviction from an evidential perspective.
Yeah.
So, I think one of the things we're going to talk about, I don't know if you want to raise it now, is what is an undesigned coincidence? And of course, a designed coincidence isn't a coincidence at all. So all coincidences must be undesigned. I think what perhaps Lydia McGrew and others, and Jonathan McLatchie, are trying to get across is that these are coincidences that are so sort of remote, in a sense, that it's impossible to imagine that they could have been collusion, that they could have been anything other than coincidences. It's impossible to think that there was design behind them. But I think, then we're back to that problem that if they're that sort of small and slight, then it's very difficult to say they carry that much weight.
Yes.
particularly with the
So
apparent contradictions. Yeah.
yeah. So to me, the contradictions are obvious. That it's there in the text. What one gospel says A and the other one says not A. Whereas you've got to do a lot of work to get to your even that there is a genuine undesigned coincidence. So we've unpicked the fact that there's two ways of, you've got to specify for sure that the feeding of 5,000 did happen in Bethsaida, which is contentious to say the least, and then that from what Andrew was saying, that Philip was actually from Bethsaida as well, and neither have been established that clearly. So it's getting a lot of work just to get to the point that there is
and then there's the elephant
coincidence.
in the room, though, Ed, the elephant in the room that John concedes that, say, Luke had a copy of Mark. And so it's like, but I'm not going to use my knowledge of Mark. I'm going to just give my own eyewitness testimony that's come down to me against the other book, which is the other eyewitness testimony. And then we get this amazing undesigned coincidences. But don't look over there, because Luke copied most of it anyway, because it means he does know it. But it's now got this interesting thing where you know the other person's story, but you're choosing just to put your eyewitness undesigned coincidences in there that happen to dovetail with the other one. But all the time, there's this elephant in the room that you actually know it. And if you know it, you've got the possibility of a designed coincidence, as you were saying, Francis. So therefore,
well, as I was saying, was actually a bit of an oxymoron, but yes, I know
to have
what,
a designed
what you mean.
coincidence. It's like saying, if somebody wanted to do that, you go, oh, I've got the story, I've got the script in front of me. Oh, great, I'll write this down because it dovetails lovely. But that would be designed, and therefore not a coincidence. And so therefore, bringing in the synoptic puzzle changes everything to do with this. And yet it's the silent elephant that's set aside, because Jonathan will just proceed as if this elephant isn't in the room, even though he says, I acknowledge it, because, fatigue is acknowledging that, in fact, it's an argument for copying. He acknowledges, in fact, that Mark copied, but he doesn't acknowledge that there was fatigue in the copying. But to me, the copying undoes undesigned coincidences right there, in the way I think it would come about.
Yeah. And I want to give a couple of quick examples of what these undesigned coincidences are, to show that there is a lot of work that needs to be undertaken just to get to base camp, that there is a undesigned coincidence to worry about. So one of them is this greener grass that was briefly mentioned. And so this is after Jonathan has come back to us in his blog and slightly adjusted things. We're in the case now that the grass was green, and isn't it amazing? Because if another of so Mark says the grass was green at the feeding of the 5,000, and John says it was at Passover, and isn't that amazing? Because it rains around Passover time, and actually, after all the to and froing, we've got that the rain is significant from November through to March, April in that area. So that is not much of a coincidence. There's a lot of year where it could have been green. And another example is in Mark, only in Mark does the story of the disciples being sent out into the countryside to do preaching and miracles for Jesus. The disciples are in pairs. And in the same passage, only in Matthew does the disciples are listed, and they're listed as in pairs. So that is considered an undesigned coincidence, which to me is not at all obvious. And actually, there's a lovely contradiction in that same story, and that is in one of the Gospels. I think. Oh, I've forgotten which. It says you mustn't take a staff with you on this preaching into the countryside. And in the other two Gospels, it says you must take a staff. So there's an easy contradiction there, which is much easier to establish than this undesigned coincidence that's supposedly taken from it.
Or you can tell, as some people do, one of the podcasts I listen to on criticizing undesigned coincidences is actually respond in with the data, but with another argument, like the fatigue one. There's the the one about who hit me. Have you heard that one? They put a blindfold on Jesus and said to the people, guess who hit you? And one of them, it doesn't mention the blindfold. So you got this bizarre thing of I think it's in Mark or one of them where they say prophesy or something, and I think it's Mark that says prophesy. Even that's a bit of a puzzle because it doesn't say what about. Matthew says prophesy who hit you. And then the other one has the mask in it, that they put a mask on him, and that makes sense. And they go, aha, you see, it must have happened but it could have equally been that Matthew could have just fatigued or not when he was copying over Mark, not mentioning just in a sense slipping. Jonathan's already admit you can misspeak. He slipped a word, didn't put the mask in, and made his sentence not actually that make sense of it, because it's like, who hit you? But why? You can just see who's in front of you, but the mask is in the other gospel. So even then you could have, okay, it could be an undesigned coincidence here, but here's an explanation on fatigue, or just forgetting something, or forgetting to copy the sentence fully over. Makes perfect sense if he knew Mark, and he did. So to me, once you can, either through your way, Ed, through contradictions, or through other ways, if you can explain the data of undesigned coincidences without even going to mainstream scholarship, then you've done your job. Because there's another possibility. It's Matthew's forgetting something, not he's telling true eyewitness testimony that dovetails perfectly with the other story. Both could be made a claim for at best. Just to wrap up here, I would do a book title called, a bit like not the encyclopedia one, I'd say an encyclopedia of apparent undesigned coincidences, and then you'd have a book that would basically settle each one. So an encyclopedia of apparent undesigned coincidences, because they might be apparent, but you could settle them, a bit like the contradictions.
Yes, you heard it here first. White on apparent undesigned coincidences will be in a bookstore near you.
Encyclopedia, so it's got to be really big.
Yeah, and go through every single one and explain them as they explain away apparent contradictions. We'll do the same. Anyway, yeah. So I think we've done our job, at least to having alternate explanation and to everything that Jonathan is saying. Yep,
and we hope that Josh and John are proud of us.
Yes, I hope they're listening now, and there's a smile on both.
We hope Jonathan doesn't feel we've been unfair to him.
Yes, there is that, because we do like him, the way that he's come on our show, and
it was very good to come on and have three of us challenge him. It's quite something, isn't it?
Yeah.
So but yes, and I hope Jonathan and Josh and John are all sort of like happily taking all this in.
Our ramblings.
Yes, our ramblings. Okay, so until next time, for our next episode, I've been Andrew, your host.
I've been Francis.
And I've been Ed. Goodbye.
Bye.